Hey there and welcome back to another Christmas retrospective video. And I've decided that the 90s were a wild time, at least in regards to the animation industry. It was a weird transitional stage for the medium. In the early golden era, back in like the 40s and 50s, studios like Walt Disney Animation were known far and wide for crafting exciting and entertaining cinematic experiences. But as the decades passed, the quality of these films started to decline, and so too did their prestige. And so, by the time of the 80s, animation wasn't nearly as prestigious or popular. Nowadays, we're used to seeing billion-dollar box office smashes from the big studios. Back then, the majority of these big studios weren't even around, and Disney was extremely hit or miss. Hell, the majority of studios in those days were direct-to-video type things. Nothing wrong with it, but it's just how it was. But then we had the new wave. First, the Disney Renaissance kicked things off, and then we saw the rise of Pixar and DreamWorks as well. And so suddenly, it was a bit of a wild west. Everybody wanted in on the lucrative new enterprise. Animation was back, baby. And so we'd see heaps of flash-in-the-pan animation studios and see direct-to-video studios re-gear themselves to attempt theatrical releases. Gotta get that sweet box office. And so, in a truly glorious era, this would result in some very wacky films being put to the big screen, and many of them starring some pretty big name actors. And thus, this brings me to the focus of today's video, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the movie, which was released by Good Times Entertainment, yeah, I don't know who they are either, in 1998. And of course, as I said, if you've never heard of Good Times Entertainment, I don't blame you. This was their first theatrical release, and prior to this they'd only worked on direct-to-video things. They'd already risen to prominence earlier in the 1990s, as they, like everybody else, could smell the blood in the water after the release of The Little Mermaid in 1989. And so, they started to release their own versions of Disney films, with their home video releases conveniently coinciding with the release of the home video releases of other major studios. E.g., here is a possible scenario. Oh, you're releasing your Pinocchio, are you, Disney? You're bringing it out of the vault. Oh, what a coincidence, because our version of Pinocchio's out on video as well. Wouldn't it be a shame if clueless parents bought our version for their kids because it's cheaper and they don't know any better? And this is how it would go. They had versions of Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, and they'd often work in conjunction with the infamous Golden Films, which would animate many of these stories to be released by Good Times. Hell, I mean, Disney even outright sued them for this. And they... Disney ended up losing. With the caveat that Good Time had to put their logo front and center on all future releases to prevent confusion going forward. But, I mean, isn't that wild? Like, what a strange point in time. Of course, both of these studios are now defunct as of the early 2000s, and this era of animation has largely been lost to time. As nowadays we look back on the 90s and we only reflect on the past glories, and not the crazy stuff. But I mean, I can't believe they managed to defeat Disney in a lawsuit when they used some of the scummiest tactics available. Oh well, they're dead and gone now. But oh boy did they leave behind some truly glorious content for us to cringe at. Because yes, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is pretty cringe. It's one of the biggest film flops I've ever seen in my entire life. And so yes, let's start to untangle this plot a little bit. So the film begins with the birth of Rudolph, the son of Blitzen, and Mitzi, a little reindeer born with a red glowing nose. However, after his uncles Cupid, Comet, and Dasher arrive, this nose becomes a problem, as he starts to be viewed as a freak of nature. And at the same time as all of this is going on, after collecting letters to deliver to Santa, two elves crash their snowmobile as they cross the bridge of the Ice Queen, Stormala, and they accidentally destroy her ice sculptures in the process. And since Santa won't hand them over to be, I guess, imprisoned, she curses them. If anybody ever crosses her bridge again, she's gonna unleash a great storm that will wipe them all out. We then time skip to the next year, where Rudolph faces some intense schoolyard bullying from Arrow, his cousin and Cupid's son. However, he does make one single friend, Zoe. We then time skip again to the reindeer games, where despite his hardships, Rudolph has a good chance to win the whole thing, and thus be chosen by Santa as a potential new flyer. But after being taunted by Arrow, his nose glows and distracts the other racers, which in turn gets him disqualified. Dejected by both this and then hearing his dad complain about his red nose, he runs away from home and gets himself good and lost, meeting the Arctic fox Slyly and the polar bear Leonard. Meanwhile, Zoe goes out looking for him and crosses Stormalla's bridge and immediately gets kidnapped. And of course, Stormalla unleashes a massive storm to punish the North Pole for somebody daring to cross her forbidden bridge. And Rudolph and his friends are alerted by the fairies of the Northern Lights and thus go on a quest to save the day. And they do. And they even manage to turn Stormalla good. And then Rudolph leads Santa's sleigh through the storm and is a celebrated hero. And yeah, this film didn't do well. I know, right? With a script like that, what could possibly have gone wrong? Anyway, on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 40% critical score and a 58% audience score. And 10,000 reviews somehow. Jeez. So yeah, it's not doing too hot. And it's really not hard to see why either. For starters, the animation just isn't good. I mean, it's fine for a home video release type of deal, you know, so you're sifting through your granny's cupboard as a kid and you find this thing at the back. At this stage, you know what you're getting into. You know it's going to be trash, but you can't help but watch. But it just isn't theatrical release quality. Imagine sitting down to watch this in the cinema and seeing this level of animation. Ugh. And on top of that, like I've mentioned before, the narrative is so bad. And the script is god-awful as well. Like, how does it get greenlit? It's just so cringy. And on top of that, they forked out what I assume was some decent money to get some big-name actors. Whoopi Goldberg, Debbie Reynolds, John Goodman. And yet they couldn't direct them to a halfway decent performance. There is no good voice performance in this film. And I say it's probably got to be due to the truly terrible script, right? And don't ask me how, but somehow the budget for this cinematic disaster came out to around $10 million. I know, right? How? I mean, I guess the big name actors would have to be one of the biggest money sinks. But would that just be it? Actually, now I'm thinking about it, I kind of think, yeah, it has to be it. That has to be the thing. Literally nothing about this film, the visuals, the soundtrack, anything at all, screams like they sunk any money into it. So they just made a piece of shit, and then they threw money at these actors hoping for the best. And of course, it failed in hilarious fashion. Like I said earlier, $10 million budget. Even by the standards of the 90s, that's pretty small. And so you'd think at the theatrical release they'd at least have a chance of making back their investment. At least just making back what they put into it. After all, Hoodwinked managed to do it, and then some. But alas, it was not meant to be. Because this thing bombed, and it bombed hard. Like, did it earn a couple of million? Nope. It earned $100,000. That is all it grossed. That has to be one of the worst financial flops I've ever seen, ever. And I mean, maybe in the end they managed to make it all back on home video sales, but I doubt it. Because the fact is, within 7 years, this studio was bankrupt. And so it really doesn't do a whole lot for my confidence in that regard. I don't think this thing made any money at all. And so, against the odds, this completely random studio managed to grind out one of the worst performing Christmas films ever. Hell, one of the worst performing animated films ever. At least in terms of its theatrical release. And if nothing else, that is quite amusing. It's a feat that we probably will never see again. After all, these tiny studios making home video releases are largely a thing of the past, at least in the West. Russia still churns out glorious films like Pinocchio from this year, but those are very rare and they don't come out in the cinemas. And so, yeah, that's it. Hope you've enjoyed our trip down memory lane to remember one of the weirdest eras in animated history. The wacky Wild West of the 90s knockoff studios and their failed attempt to crack the theatrical market. And so with all that being said, that's the end of the video. And these have just been my opinions, and I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the film if you've seen it? Do you like it, hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.